Hey guys, welcome back to another video. In this video, we'll be working on the code problem number 28, in which we're going to implement the strStr function. So without further ado, let's get right into it. In this function, what we want to do is we want to return the index of the first occurrence of a needle in the haystack. If that needle doesn't exist, then we want to return -1. I think it might make a little more sense if we go through some examples. So let's look at the first example that they give. If our haystack is a string called hello and our needle is ll, we want to return 2 because if we go to our index 2, 0, 1, 2, then starting at index 2, we can see that we have the string ll or the needle ll inside of our haystack. If we look at the second example, we have our haystack is 5 A's and our needle is BBA. Obviously, we can see that the string BBA isn't inside of our haystack, so we just return -1 because it doesn't exist. And lastly, looking at the example 3, if our needle is of length 0, we want to return 0 as well. And the reason we want to do that is because it states over here that we will return 0 when the needle is an empty string, since it's consistent with C's strStr and Java's index of functions. So that's the basic gist of what we have to implement. And without further ado, I copied the problem into the Google Doc with examples and all. And so we'll be referencing this a little and we can start coding. So I think the first thing we want to keep track of is the length of our needle, because whenever we're taking a substring out of our haystack or comparing a substring of our haystack, we want to make sure that we have the right length so that we're comparing with the right length of the needle. And so what I'm going to do is for the first line of code, I'm going to say length is going to be equal to len needle. And actually, before we do that, the first thing we want to do, let's just handle the base cases to get those out of the way. And what I mean by that is handle situations where either our haystack is of length 0 or our needle is of length 0. So the first thing we want to check is, like we saw before, if the length of our needle is of length 0, we're just going to return 0, if I can type properly. If the length of our haystack is 0, we're going to return -1. And the reason we return -1, if our haystack is an empty string, there's no way that any string of our needle can be inside of an empty string. So we're just going to return -1 right there. So those are the two kind of base cases we want to handle for right away. And let's get back into the actual code. And so now that we have our length, the next thing I'm thinking we should have is have a variable called I. That's going to be our index pointer, so that we can have that pointer point at some letter essentially in our haystack, so that we know what characters we want to compare and what character we want to start with when we're comparing. And so now what we want to do is we want to see to what point do we want our index pointer to go to. So if we reference this first example here with hello and ll, one thing we should notice is that there's no point of letting our index pointer go to this last O here, or compare anything past our O, because or anything past our second L, because we know that the length of the rest of our haystack, or the length of the string after that second L, is less than the length of our needle. So there's no point of even checking because we know there's no way they can match. And so what that means is we want to find out the index at which we want to stop our needle or our index pointer from moving, so that we don't have to compare the needle anymore. If we look over here, our hello substring, our hello haystack, is of length 5, and our needle is of length 2. And we also know that the last character we want to compare is the second L, because we know that anything after that, the length of our substring is going to be less than the length of our needle. So if we look at it, we can see the length of our haystack right here, which is 5, the length of our needle, which is 2. If we do 5 minus 2, we get 3. And we know the index of this second L here is 3, because if we go index 0 is the H, index 1 is the E, index 2 is the first L, and index 3 is the second L. And so what that means is that at index 3, that's the last index we want our I pointer to go to. Anything after that, we can just go out of our while loop and return -1, because if we do get to that point, that means we never found a match for our needle. Obviously, in this case, we would find a match at this first L, but hypothetically, if we don't have a match and our I pointer goes all the way to the point where the rest of our haystack is less than the length of our needle, at that point we can just return -1. And the next thing, one thing we do want to make sure is that we don't want to have an off by 1 error. And since we know that index 3 is the last start of the character that we want to compare, we know that our I pointer has to be less than 4. And the reason we do that is to make sure that we do compare the letters after that third index, whatever we need to. And so to make sure that we get to that third index, we need to make sure our index is less than 4 in this situation. And so how do we do that? We can just do length haystack minus length needle, which in this case would return 1, and then just add the 1 to make sure that we don't go past that. And so that is how we can, that is kind of the length that we know we need to go to, or the index that we need to go to. So if I do len haystack minus len, I can just say length because we stored it, plus 1. And so now what we want to do the actual comparison. Now that we have our index pointers, we want to get a substring of our haystack that starts at that at that character on the I pointer and moving forward from there. And so what we want to say is the length of our haystack from I to I plus length. And so if we look at an example, say we take the hello. In our first iteration, our I is going to be equal to 0, right? And so what we want to do is if we have our I is equal to 0, we're going to have the H is at index 0, and our E is going to be at index 1. And so we don't want to look at that first L. And so what we do, we can just call haystack 0 to 2. Because when we're indexing Python strings in this manner, the 2 is exclusive, which means the character at the index 2, it doesn't return that character. It's only going to return the characters at index 0 and index 1 in this case. And so by doing this, we're just going to return return 2 characters that we can compare to our needle. And so that is the basic idea of doing from I to I plus length. So we'll only return the number of characters that we need. And then we just want to compare if that's equal to the needle. We're going to return I, because we just want to return the index that we're on, because we know starting from that index and going length wide, that is equal to the needle. So we just want to return the index. If that is not the case, and the substring is not equal to the needle, we're going to increment our I index, or our I pointer by 1. And at the very end, if we get to a point where we loop through everything, we never found a match, we're just going to return -1. And so that is everything that we need to do within our strStr function. We handle for base cases, we handle for moving our index pointer, we're comparing, and we're making sure we're not comparing more than we need to. And through this, I think we hopefully have solved what we need to. So I'm just going to quickly copy and paste, or not necessarily copy and paste, but write the code in the editor here so that we can test our code afterwards. If it's equal to 0, we're going to return -1. I is going to be equal to 0. Length is going to be equal to len and needle. Oh, wrong one. While I is less than the length of our haystack minus length plus 1. We are going to check if our haystack I plus length, if that's equal to our needle. If it isn't, or if it is, we're going to return I. Else we're going to increment our I pointer. At the very end, we're just going to return -1. And we have our test cases here. Let me run this. This is the first example that they have with the hello and LL, and it ran. And so I'm actually going to add a few other test cases. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is the second test case that they have in example 2. The 2 empty strings is a third example. I'm going to add another example of my own with an empty haystack. and I'm going to add a last example with an empty needle so that we can kind of compare all those situations. So if I run the code now, hopefully it should run all those test cases. So it does. We get the correct outputs for all of them. And now I'm just going to hit submit, and hopefully it'll pass the Leetcode test as well. So as you can see here, it did. This is how we can code up the strStr function in Leetcode problem number 28. Hopefully this helps you guys, and see you guys in the next one. All right, later.